For those of you who don't know me, since I'm relatively new on campus, my name is Gordon Melton. I'm one of the newer people that have joined the staff of the Institute for Studies of Religion. Byron Johnson, our leader, is off at some rehab. He's been having some problems with his shoulder lately, and he was supposed to be here to do this, but here I am. I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Almost from the time I came here 2 years ago, Byron and I have been talking about bringing Dr. Chan to campus and trying to work out ways to do this. We discovered several weeks ago that he was going to be in the United States. Got in touch with him. He and I are actually going to a conference at Purdue tomorrow to spend 2 days talking about Chinese Pentecostalism. When I first started going to China back in 2001, I can remember the first trip I took there was to Hong Kong. At that time, I knew one person in all of China, colleague Ed Irons, who I had met through my study of new religions back in the 90s. I contacted him before my first trip and said, I'm supposed to be putting together some programs in China. I need some help. Can you introduce me around? And the very first person he took me to meet was Dr. Chan. It has blossomed into a friendship. I have developed the greatest of respect for this man. He's a very, very fine scholar. I've brought a couple of his books, which now grace my shelves at home. His book on Protestantism in Contemporary China, while beginning to get a little dated now, it's still a very, very fine introduction. And his most recent publication on religious freedom in China, which includes within it a compilation of all the legal regulations of religions have to go through, and part of which he'll explain to us a little bit about this afternoon. He's going to spend around 40 minutes, about half of our time together, talking to us, and then has promised to open up for questions. So questions both about what he talks about and any questions you have relative to Christianity and religion in China today. He'll be happy to entertain. And so without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to Dr. Kim-Kwong from Hong Kong.
Shall I use this one or?
No, just leave it there.
Oh, okay. Just trying to see.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon, for the fine introduction, and thank you for arranging me to come here to Baylor Universities, and it's my first time in Texas. Of course, first time in Baylor too. And before I came, I just found out a colleague of mine in my office. She was actually graduated from Baylor in the 70s. And she told me that there's in any important event in Baylor, you have to shout out the word like, say embarrassed, something like that. And they said, well, if you shout that out, then the things will be fine. And I said, is this some kind of folk religion here, superstitions? And she said, no, but you have to do that. So I just did that, say embarrassed. So I hope that will go fine. Okay. Well, for those you're here, I think you'll be interested to know more about Christianity in China. But before I launch into about the Christianity in contemporary China, I will just say a few words on the context of which Christianity is situated in China, namely the political and social context. I mean, basically, in the People's Republic nowadays. And it has, the general context is that is part of religion in China. So before we look at Christianity, I would like to say a few words on religion in China. And before that, there's some concept we have to get across, because very easy we would try to interpret Christianity in China from our perspective, our socio political, even legal perspective, which is maybe a bit difficult. For example, you see that? Well, first of all, we are talking about freedom of religion in United States or in other countries, but in China it's freedom of religious belief, not freedom of religion. The difference is that religion is regarded as, by the government, as a private matter, not a social matter. In other words, religion cannot run schools because it's a social matter. You can have all kinds of belief you want, they don't care, but you don't infringe into the public domain. So this is the basic difference. So there's a lot of differences. So we all often misinterpret, why China doesn't have religious freedom? Well, China has religious freedom of religious belief and not religious freedom. It's a totally different concept. Secondly, in China it's always state over religion. Religion is just a subgroup of the order over the social governance by the government. And also state defines what is religion, what is not religion. So bear in mind that China is different from USA. And we have to understand religion in the context of China, not context of not the other context. So state-defined religion. Right now the government states that there are only 5 major religions, but other minor religions are also accepted in China. For example, the LDS, the Mormons, the Baha'is, and the Judaisms, and a whole range of other folk religions as well. And also bear in mind that in China, there are always multi-religious and multi-ethnics. Like in the West, I think the Christianity is the predominant religion basically in the past and also in the United States. But in China, there's always many different religions coexisting in China. And Christianity is just a very small minority of other religions as well. And in terms of the policy, that the government always insists that religion is allowed to exist in China so long as in harmony with the society, supportive to the regime. In other words, social stability is the top priority of the government. And any other policy related to religion has to be first to accept and in harmony or in line with that harmony in society. So that in China there are so-called religious policy. In other words, the government has a certain view. The policy also control mechanisms, legal procedures to define and to allow religion to exist in China. Basically, it's under control, confined, and contained. In other words, religion is allowed to exist in certain located space, legal space, physical space, and time, and within which you do whatever you like, but you cannot go beyond that. There are a whole range of government mechanisms to have administration over religious matters. First of all, you have the Religious Affairs Bureau, and which is under the State Council. Like China operates like in a dual system. On the one hand, you have the party, which is one-party state. On the other hand, you have the civil government, which is the execution of the policy. The party decides on the policy in a very simple way, and the executive arm to execute the policy in terms of the legal procedures and other mechanisms. So Religious Affairs Bureau is the execution arm which we hear the most. But yet behind the Religious Affairs Bureau, you have the United Work Department, which is a crazy name. It's difficult to comprehend. But anyways, this is on the party side, which decides on the policies. And then the Religious Affairs Bureau will execute the policy. So this is the drafting of the policy, this is the execution of the policies. And also in any policy in China, it's not just, China is a huge bureaucracy lasting for more than 2,000 years. It's as old as even older than the Vatican's, two oldest continuous running bureaucracies in the world. We have 5 levels of administrations. In other words, you have the policy draft up, and then you have all those guidelines and all those execution bodies. You have the central, or I would say the national level of the administration. And then on the provincial level, you have another counterpart, say you have the National Religious Affairs Administration, and then you have the Provincial Religious Affairs Bureau, and then you have the Municipal Religious Affairs Bureau, you have the County Religious Affairs Bureau, and then you have Township Religious Affairs Bureaus. In other words, any kind of ministry in China, you have these 5 levels. And this is on the vertical side of it. On the horizontal side of it, in the State Council, how many ministries are there in China? More than 120. So you have horizontal, vertical, altogether you have about 60 million people on government payrolls. Now you have it. Well, how many national, well, there's one nation, about 31 provincial levels, municipal level 222, county levels 2,885, townships, counties. But at the county level, they can still draft laws because county is a very independent unit. So, in other words, you have so many governments in China, depending whom to speak to, whom to relate to. County A can have certain policies that exercise this way. County B may have totally different. So you have so many conflicting news from China, they're all true. Because China is so big. And one province may do something, the other province may do a different thing. And whatever what you do, the central government may or may not know about that. So whenever when there's a reporter asks the central government's office or the press office, do you know certain place that certain people got arrested? Oh, I'm going to check about that. Oh, look, we only have 1.3 billion people. So it takes a while to check out. And everything is the Chinese government. You get about 60 million people on the payroll, so many ministries, so many offices, so many independent governments, and everyone can say they are part of the government, right? This is called bureaucracy. So understanding that kind of huge national setup, and China is still operating, still running, this is a miracle, in spite of all the bureaucracies. And not only running, and still achieving 7.5 GDP per year for the past 30 years. This is amazing. So in other words, you see some phenomena, and then the government is trying to set some policies, try to catch up with it, but the next day, and then it's always a catching up game. So China works in a totally different way, in a way. So you have to have the larger context, and then within which you see that there's a lot of gray areas, and we exist and we operate mostly in the gray areas. It's not right or wrong, not black and white. It's both and, not neither nor. Okay. Now, so now you have those administrative bodies, and then you have the official religious bodies. In other words, the 5 main religions. Each religion will have their own national setup, and then they have the provincial setup, they have the county setup, they have municipal setup, even the township setups. So all will have this kind of hierarchical structure. In the Protestant, we call it Free Self-Patriotic Movements or China Christian Council, and then they have staff from the national level and all levels, and they're supposed to represent some branches of Christianity. And similarly, you have the Taoists, you have the Buddhists, you have the Catholics, you have the Muslims. Those are the 5 main religions. They all have all this set up. And then, other than religious affairs bureaus they are in charge of the religious affairs directly, you have the public security bureaus that are in charge of the so-called, the Religious Affairs Bureau is in charge with the normal religion, those religions which are within the so-called legal domain. And for all those who exist outside of the so-called legal framework, then they are called the abnormal religious activities, which then will be under the scrutiny of the Public Security Bureau. In other words, the legal side is being taken care of by the RABs, all those who are not registered illegal side who will be taken care of by the Public Security Bureau, which they have all the branches and all that. So the problem is that you hear some news that, some Christian got arrested, and then you ask, what about the religious right? I never know about it. It's not part of my jurisdiction. They are on the illegal side. And you talk about the Public Security Bureau's people, well, why are they arrested? Because they're illegal. Do they report to this bureau? Do they will have correspondence? Will they work coincide with the Religious Affairs Bureau? They don't. Well, you get only about, in the provincial level, you get only about 110 or 15 ministries. They don't talk with each other. They seldom do. And also depending on the rankings, the PSB is a half rank higher than the RAB. So I don't have to talk with you. I do what I like. And then you have the other special branches outside of that is they take care of those evil cults, because in China, other than the religion, the normal religion, the so-called minor religions, you have other groups that are being labeled as by the Chinese government as evil cults, and all those evil cults are under a separate office. So, okay, this is a job creation. There's so many people. Someone's got to work. 60 million, 70 million. Then another office, you hold the branches from national level all the down to the county level. Now, and then you have the Public Security Bureau that's in charge of the internal, like, public securities. Now you have the National Security Bureau. What if those religions are related with outsiders? Say some missionaries went to China and tried to do something. So it's under the NAB, it's not a PSB. And then they have all the corresponding things. And now, what about the religion that with China has 56 ethnic groups at least. There are 55 ethnic minorities, and some of the ethnic minorities are embracing religion as well. For example, some of the Uyghurs, they're all Muslims. The Tibetans, mostly they are Buddhists. So you have another ministry that's in charge of national minority affairs. And also they have religious branches. If it is, say, a Tibetan who is a Buddhist who got caught, it's not the religious affairs, it is the national minority affairs. It gets a bit complicated. Well, it gets a bit confusing. Well, China is a Confucius society. Now, having said all that, now we come to briefly about Christianity in China. So, basically, Christianity in China is just a small group. Never have ever been any dominating places. It lives coexisting with other groups, and also as a latecomer into the scene of China. And in the Christian branches, you have basically the four different ones: the Protestants, the Catholics, and then the Eastern Orthodox, and then you have also the Church of the East. And actually, other than the Coptic, well, now even the Coptics are now in China. So you have all five branches had been, and most of them are still continue existing in China. So not just the Protestants. When we talk about Christianity in China, not just the Protestants, please. All branches are being represented in China. Okay, Church of the East, Nestorians. Actually, the Nestorians, the latest record we have was as late as in 1880s. But now the Nestorians are coming back to China. They just do a lot of translations, set up their small small parishes in Hong Kong, and with some followers in China now. The Church of the East, or the Assyrian Church of the East. Okay. Some of the relics, but they are still very much existing, though some of the relics of the Nestorian Church. Now you have the Orthodox Church. In China, more than 300 years, you have the Slavonic Rite. In 1995, they were as much as 300,000 believers with more than 100 priests in China. At that time, it was an autonomous Chinese Orthodox Church, the latest Orthodox autonomous church in the Orthodox family. But it was not reinstituted because they are lacking a bishop. Now there's about 20 to 30,000 believers with one priest. But the patriarch had made a historical visit in May 2013 to China just a few months ago. And those are the Chinese martyrs of the Russian Orthodox Church. Russian Orthodox Church in China, one of those in Harbin, nice buildings. That one now is in a museum. Now this is the last remaining priest, as of last week, still alive, 94 years old. Still actively performing liturgy in Slavonic, Old Russian. Now the Orthodox patriarch visited China just a few months ago, and he became the first international Christian leader at that ranking ever being invited to China, and not by the church, by the president himself. So it's a state visit. So that's a historical moment. And you have the Greek Orthodox and the Coptic Orthodox in Hong Kong, China. Roman Catholics, well, more than 700 years in China, side of Vatican tensions, which I'm not going over here, and with Matteo Ricci and others. And This is the Catholic Church in Shanghai, the cathedrals, and those are the pilgrimage. You have the so-called the underground church and the above ground church. Both are actually quite well known. I mean, you don't hide a 7-story building of underground seminary. So when we say underground and above ground, it's just for technicality, but you don't hide anything in China, you can't. I'll tell you a secret. Don't tell anyone. There's no secret in China. Protestants. Okay. Now let's go over the Christianities in here. The Protestant church. Now in 1949, just 1 million. 1983, 3 million. Now the rapid growth in rural areas, but the growth has been a bit slower in these recent years because of the rapid urbanizations and urban growth. Now the figures can be anywhere from 26 mil from the official figures to 100 mil, some very high numbers, which I have strong reservations, depending of course the methodologies, which you can take a course in the religion department here to find out what is the statistic means relation with religion. And it's multiple traditions and multiple church polities. In other words, in any of the churches in China, you may have episcopal systems, you may have the very free church system, you may have those liturgical systems. It all depends on the background and what they learn and how they do it. So in other words, there's no one type of church in China. There's so many differences. Well, but on the other hand, you have more than 100 million Bible being printed in China already. It's the largest Bible producing country in the world nowadays. And more than 20, there's above ground seminaries, but numbers of the non-registered seminary Bible schools. Now, one of those traditional churches built in the 1930s integrated with Chinese traditions, one of the older ones in China, and you have the typical scene of it. Now I'm going to go through some of the churches in China. All of those I've took the pictures and I visited those, and for some years in there. This is a church by the national minority group just at the border of Myanmar and China. This is a Karen group, actually. Oh, I'm sitting right there. And those are the drums and the things they learned from the American Baptists because they're where they came from, the traditions. And those building styles are much like the Karen styles. This is another church built by the Germans in early 1900s. I don't know why the sound comes. Now, you have another typical urban contemporary church. This is in Hangzhou, seats about 5,000 people. This is kind of a mega church. Look at the style, it's quite modern. Inside of a church, no different from any kind of big churches you see in the States and elsewhere. And a huge cross here and a huge band here. And also above the roof, they have a special glass ceiling of a huge cross and with lights up. So whenever the plane flies over the city, Hangzhou, and at nighttime you see a big white cross shining out. This is one way they express Christianity. Because you can't have any public advertisements. So they try to build up signs or whatever to tell people that they are Christians here. Now, this is an urban grand church, newly built, it's about 2,000 or 3,000. This is a very humble one, used to be a Methodist church in Tangshan. After the earthquake, they rebuilt the whole thing in 1980s inside of the church. Although this is another church in Gansu province in the Lanzhou. Okay, look at this building just next to that. This is the provincial parties buildings. This is the church buildings. By law, that no church building can be taller than the parties of the government building. So it's about so that's a very Chinese symbolic thing. You don't try to outbeat the party there. Who's in charge now? Okay, you have a church that's newly built. This very liturgical style, Anglican style. You have all those altars and things. They still follow the Anglican liturgy in this one. You have some very simple ones that just try to pack as much people as possible. And you have some rural church, but very grand style in Wenzhou areas. I asked them, well, why do you put all these top on that? They said, well, they were told that church should look like that because they got some pictures and postcards and internet. So they just built just right off what they thought that it would look like a church. And then they put all these kind of set up here. Whatever style you like to say it. It's quite typical. And this is a very humble one in the Guizhou areas, where it used to be the Methodist mission with the national minority people. And And this is a very typical rural church just at the border of Laos and China. This is in a rural church built in northern China. And this is a very simple one, open air church. With a loudspeaker here because there's not enough space and we're all in the courtyard. Now this is even very a church using old barn converted as a church, and I was just walking out there, and later on this building was declared unsafe because, and this is a typical rural church. Oh, this is the old one that's declared unsafe. We have to build a new one for them. Otherwise, if you try to sing, or if you try to do something more than just singing, it may collapse. So you cannot have any charismatic group there. Maybe Baptists, okay. Or the Presbyterians, orders. Okay, now this is the interesting one. This is one of the very first Tibetan Christian church. See the design here is typical Tibetan. They all dress their Sunday best. So I'm here choosing a Tibetan dress. It's about this church is located 3,200 meters above sea level in top of the mountain. Took me 2 days, got up there to training with them, and they started it with just one person, this elder, about 18 years ago, and then he received the gospel and spread to his family and then the whole village. Now the whole village is Christian by just one person, and later on, within 10 years, they built 18 other churches. But none of them is recorded because on the one hand, the government of course knows that how are you going to hide the buildings even though it's on top of mountains. But on the other hand, you don't register, you acknowledge the existence of it, and everyone is doing is meeting there. It's no trouble, no problem. I mean, it's not legal, it's not illegal. It's Chinese style. Okay, some post-earthquake scenes. Okay, now let's get back to. I don't have to cut this off, but just sorry. Okay. Now I just have a few things to say about the population and definitions. Now, there are some wild figures from anywhere from 26 million to 100 million of Christians in China. The first thing is that, how do you define a Christian? Without definition, all the numbers are with no meaning. Do you mean this is something with certain initiation rites, baptized or what? What if they baptize and they don't come to church anymore? Is it Christian or what? Or do you calculate that if they have active Christian activities, say once a week or once every 2 weeks, or how about those who are not baptized? Yes, they live certain kind of lifestyle that's similar to a Christian. They follow certain doctrine. For example, I know many people in the army they cannot baptize because the army in China that are basically not the army of the Chinese government. It's the army, the military force of the party. It's a party's military branch. So therefore, you're supposed to be all party members, or at least to pledge Marxism. So how are they going to become a Christian? If they are a Christian, they cannot baptize. They will do it only after they retire. Or even they don't baptize at all, but they live like Christians. Do you count them as one? So therefore, we have a huge methodological problems here. So my working figure is about 50 to 50 millions actively participating in some kind of Christian related activities. Because you also have a lot of those so-called fellowships, which may or may not be a church, and then they may have no liturgy, no initiation, right? They may have just studied the Bible and living out whatever they feel like, similar to certain according to certain Christian values. So therefore, numbers sometimes carry few meanings in China. Is the impact, I will ask the question is that how does the Christian, the religion impact the society if there's any impact at all? Now, for example, I did a very interesting study before that was in a region in China where you have highest percentage of Christians in the urban population. That's Wenzhou area, they claim about 15% of the populations are Christian, which is quite high, almost as high as Singapore or even higher than Hong Kong in that case. And then this is also one of the highest place where you have the entrepreneurs. And then I checked in that particular city, my argument is that if you have a high level of Christianity, does it mean that the crime rate is lower? So I checked the crime rate of the whole province of 20 different municipalities. I don't see any differences in crime rate. So does it mean that you have high percentage of Christianity, then you have a higher, better moral or whatever? Then if you don't see the impact, then what's the meaning of Christianity in terms of figure and numbers? Now, and then you have regional differences. In China, the distribution is quite diverse. There are some provinces with a very high concentration of percentage population-wise, and some are very low. Right now, this kind of mapping is still undergone, but again, problem is that we don't have reliable statistics. I got some very high figure statistics in some places. For example, in some of the counties, some group claims that, there are more than, say, 400,000 Christians there. And that number has been used by many people, including Ted Johnson and others. And then I checked, the population of that county is even lower than the Christian population. Sometimes I wonder that are we too enthused with our methodology? But again, theologically correct. Why? We believe in communion of saints by Apostles' Creed. We count Christians past, present, and future. Who knows that 100,000 years down the road you don't have more? So, theologically correct, statistically unthinkable. Yet, in the Christian context, we all use these high figures. I wonder why. See, that's the problem. That's the problem I have. Just common sense will correct a lot of those things. But sometimes we get so enthused that common sense does not exist. And also the other problems about the migrant population in China. Like China now, we have 1.3 billion people, but last year we have more than 200 million people as migrant populations, almost like 2/3 the size of the United States. On a migrant population. Migrant population means that out of 365 days a year, they live not at their home more than 83 days. In other words, you have 1/6 of the population of China always on the road or not living at home, working elsewhere. Most of them are rural populations. So how do you account for these people, whereby if they are Christian, do they count them in the rural home areas, which the church will do, and also when they're working elsewhere, they're also being double counted in other places. And this kind of fluctuating population will demand us to have a totally different methodology to count anything in China. Okay. Now, classification. Okay. Now. Okay, that's it. Now, you heard about just the Protestants. You have the family church, home church, house church, underground church, above the government church, registered church, whatever. There are two simple classification from the Cold War period. It's a Cold War mentality at stake in the 1980s. But today, I would say a lot of churches force neither one side nor the other side. China changes a lot from since the 1980s, yet the methodology on understanding Chinese Christianity had not been basically fundamentally being challenged since 1980s. So we are a bit outdated. So therefore, my new classification is on at least 7 different types. 6 types. Double registration. Those who register with the China Christian Council and the Religious Affairs Bureau. Those are maybe 20-some million. But there are also single registration. Register with the government, but not register with the religious, sanctioned religious body, the China Christian Council or the Free Self movements. In other words, you have a lot of churches, actually for more than 15 years already, register independently with the government, especially all the churches in Xinjiang province, a number of churches in Jilin, and other places. You have a lot of these examples already, single registration. They're not part of the government so-called sanctioned registered churches, but they are registered formally with the government. And then you have those temporary registrations. Because a lot of churches cannot fully register, they get a temporary license, which can last anywhere from 6 months to 15 years. It is a de facto registration in a way. But for certain reasons, for example, they cannot have a place that they haven't employed a full-time worker, whatever, then they can only get a temporary registration. But temporary registration is as good as a registration. And then with the temporary registration, you may not necessarily to be registered with the China Christian Council because it's a temporary registration. So you get a lot of gray areas to work with. Then you have non-registered but acknowledged. In other words, a lot of those non-registered groups, they are acknowledged by the government. What do you mean by acknowledged? That means they have regular meetings with the government. Therefore, the government knows that, and they sort of, for example, more than 220 those so-called major non-registered churches in Beijing alone, they're all acknowledged by the government. That means they almost have a monthly meeting with the government officials continuously. For example, one of the very celebrated case about the Shouwan Church about 2 years ago, they've been negotiating with the government for the past 12 years on a weekly basis. So a lot of those acknowledge, but tolerate. Tolerate means that I'm going to have a group to meet here. I don't want to talk with the government, but the government knows your existence. They allow you to operate. So you don't talk to them, but they know you exist. They tolerate you. So only the last category that is prohibited is extremely rare. Out of maybe 50, 60 million Christians is extremely, extremely rare. In any case, it has to do a lot with the local politics. China is a big place, so all the government operate differently. Okay, now, so therefore, one group may be tolerate and upgrade to the acknowledged to register, or they just forget it, they are changed. In other words, there's always fluctuation in this range. And that's quite a bulk of the majority of the Christians exist in this range. Quite a lot of them. Okay. Maybe I would say 20-some millions in the double register, but maybe 20, 30 millions in all these ranges. And it's dynamic and it's dependent on the politics. So some people ask me a question, how many Christians are there in China? And I asked the same question to a very wise old man in China, who's a Christian leader. He said, well, Brother Chen, look at the sky. Do you see there are a lot of stars? I said, yes, I saw a lot of stars. Well, tonight is a bright night. What if it's a cloudy night? So, and it depends on the political weather. So in a nice state, a lot of Christians will say, I'm a Christian. But in a very stormy religious political times, you don't see any Christian. You just see a few. So how many Christians are there in China? Depend on political weather. So I guess this says a lot to get a clear picture. Now, in the register side, you have to officially recognize the group. It's a hierarchical structure, but again, with a lot of autonomy, regional autonomy, just like in the Chinese government. Like Chinese government, they have a central government, but how much would the will of the central government be carried out in the by the provincial governments? And also, even if there's a legislation on the provincial government, how much would that be carried out in the municipal government? It all depends on which region, who's in charge, what are the relationships, very local situation. Similarly, in the church, you may hear that, oh, there's a headquarters of the China Christian Council in Shanghai. They come to the States all the time. They make speeches. They make some Bible exhibition in the Washington. But how much are their desire or their policy will be carried out by say, a provincial council? Not much. It all depends on the relationship. So therefore, very much depends on where you are. So you get regional autonomy, the government that basically these councils are discharging the government's duty, political duty basically, to make sure that all the groups are behave or whatever, supporting the government's policy, and in exchange you do whatever what you like within that range. And local variations, and with a limited social interaction, because there's a clear separation between church and state, or religion and state. There's a lot of domain that you cannot infringe. For example, education is considered as the party's domain. All the education systems. You cannot run, say, Christian school. You can only run, say, Bible school. Bible school belongs to the religion side, and regular school belongs to the civil side. So no groups can compete with the ideological domain of the party. Social interaction, and basically it functions as a church body. And now for all the other non-Christian councils, I will use the term as autonomous Christian communities. I've been using that and theologically reasons. For all the different varieties, there's no one type of so-called non-registered groups. They're all different. They're all so-called, none can represent, no one group can represent another group. In other words, they all claim to be, I represent the family church. This is totally nonsense because there's so many different groups. They only can represent their own group. For example, your church, can you say, when you go out to, say, Hong Kong, China, say, I represent the Church of the United States? No, you only represent your church or at best your denomination, if you are the denominational leaders. So they all vary in size in church polity. Family church or house church actually is a misnomer because very few you exist in the church anymore. I mean in the household anymore. They all have their own buildings or some of them are larger than the others. And it's very easy to be mythologized and sensationalized by the outsiders. But we liked legends. Okay, the theology, basically, for the churches in China, no matter which camp they are basically fundamentalists at best evangelicals. Most of the churches think that evangelicals are liberals because they talk about science. Because the Christianity in China had been suspended in terms of ties with the outside world since the 1950s. Think of the church before 1950. That's where the most of the theology of the Christian Church of China came from and embraced with. And also they went through the whole 30, 40 years of difficult period of time, and they preserved the faith by their outside blood and life. And so they consider that part of faith is the only interpretation of Christian faith. Anything deviate from that, they think that is apostasy, is heresy. For example, many of the churches I visit in the rural areas, the man and woman has to sit separate aside. Men on one side, women on the other side. That's been taught by the missionaries in the 1920s and 1930s, and that was the norm at that time. So anything deviate from that is not Christian, they consider. So once I was invited to marry a couple, and now declare a man and wife, and immediately separate one side and the other side, because it's taught that's the commandment of the Christian faith. So that's fundamentalisms. And some charismatics is basically all introduced recent years, conservative yet missional, sort of. That's why the church grows so fast. Of course, there are other reasons, and very few will have socio-political agendas, and they're so few with influence at all. For the church exists in a very confined, I would say, almost like a ghetto. And it's a ghetto mentality, self-preservation, survival, and then if you try to touch any kind of socio-political agenda, you may get into very dangerous political arena, and then you may be getting in trouble. So self-preservation, pragmatism, and pastoral, and very pietistic, and in a sense, anti-intellectual is still the norm in China. That's also dated back from the legacies of the 1920s and the 30s, the whole theological on the conservatisms at that time. And multiple liturgical traditions and multiple polities, and some groups with elder Presbyterian tradition, others Methodist, others Episcopalians, others like Baptist or Free churches. And ecclesiastical characters, basically majority is a female, elderly majority is still majority, and the role-based maybe is changing because of the urbanization process. Many of the rural areas are rezoned as urban areas. So suddenly they are so-called urbanized, but mentality-wise still very rural in basis. Family ties and all that. Predominant lay leaderships exist in the gray area, a lot of them in a very diverse community. In other words, Christianity exists both in different regions, groups, and some of them the merchant classes, some of them they're all different. In other words, there's no single particular strata that is concentrated with Christians. Now Christians is just over in different groups. But overall, it's still a minority. Even think of the number, 50, 60 million, it's only 4 or 5% of the populations in China. Buddhists is a much more number, higher number, and Taoists and the folk religions. Even Muslims is about 30-some millions. And Muslims are all concentrated in certain areas so that their collective bargaining powers are quite different. And the Catholics, although they are smaller in numbers, but they are within one single hierarchy. In other words, in terms of collective mobilization, the Catholics will be much stronger than the Protestants. So the trend, you have the younger leadership, very pragmatic in nature, personality is the center, not theology, and highly autonomous and regional influence. In other words, they all claim the cluster with their own territorial claims. And there are some cultural Christian followers. In other words, Christianity, in a way, not only in the church, but also in the intellectual circles, people think that Christianity is another type of philosophy, which may contribute to the Chinese overall cultural development. But these groups will seldom have any relation, if at all, with the church per se. And then you have different fellowships, like the business fellowships, and you have those kind of ecclesial communities which may have no liturgy. I don't consider them as church, but they follow certain kind of norms or a core value, which is basically Christian in nature. And now they are beginning, the churches overall, some global mission trends. In other words, they're mission schools training, they're sending missionaries out to the different parts of the world. As far as I know, there are at least several hundreds already in the field from China. It's part of China's emerging and coming out of the country phenomena. Not particularly a church in nature, but overall China's influence in the world are increasing, so are the churches too. Now, there are two pictures I'd like to show to end this presentation and open for more Q&A. First picture is that this is an old lady. I've talked about the Tibetan church, the first one in China that I document. The Protestant church was I was there just 7-8 years ago. So this lady was from that church who was one of the first convert, and she's at her Sunday best. And she could not read nor write, but when she came into the church, the first thing she did was bow her head and pray to this new God that she experienced. With a very strong pietist mind, following a new religion, totally different from her culture, yet she embraced it fully. And each week she brought her granddaughter along, also on her Sunday best. She came to the church, looking up at the cross right at the front of the altar, and see these bags they make with a cross that symbolize their new faith. And the old lady, I will see that it represents the church in China in the past. Difficult times, yet with a very simple faith. And I see the future of the Christianity in China in this space of the young girl. They're full of potential, uncharted areas, and yet the future will be defined by her, not by me. But I see the hope there. Okay, thank you, and open for the Q&A. How should we do that? Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that there are 20 plus seminaries there. Are there requirements for ministers of registered churches, and how does that play with the seminaries?
Basically, right now there are 23, I would say, fully, registered Bible schools and seminaries in China, which trains several, like hundreds of graduates a year. Totally, they have been training more than 10,000 for the past 15-20 years. Now, basically, it goes like that. Each province will have one seminary or Bible school. And then there are some provinces with low Christian population, several of them will gather together with a regional seminary. And then there's one national one, which is the highest level of all, that's in Nanjing. So all you have to do, you have to apply. You have to be a Christian, you have to be endorsed by a church, you have to be endorsed by the local council, and then you have to write open exams. And then if you pass the exam, you'll be admitted. And after several years of training, anywhere from 3 to 4 years, and basically it's Associate of Arts to a bachelor level. And then you will be getting the degree or the license, and then wherever you come from, you go back to the home church. That's the policy. Then you go back to the church, and then you become a minister there. So that's how it works. But it's far insufficient. So therefore, each provinces, they will run different pastoral training centers. There are more than 3,000 of them in China. I mean, those, I would say, opened, registered ones, it's already more than 3,000. And they can be anywhere from 6 months to 1 year to 4-year program. Some of them are almost as good as this Bible school. But the government just have a restriction that each province will only have one. So this is the kind of planned policies. And they're changing it now. But still, that's as for the local ones, they will serve the local communities. For the brighter ones, they will send it to try to get into the, say, provincial one or the national ones. So that's how it works. So in other words, there's a whole system of theological training going on in China. And out of the 22, I have taught in 21 of them already. So I've sort of, I've been there since like some 20, some 30 years ago. And many of the faculties are my students now. So, yeah.
In what ways, in the last, you want to say last 15 to 20 years, has the Free Self Church, the CCC, changed that very much in those last 15 to 20 years? Or has it stayed pretty similar to that?
I don't think there's any major change. The structure is still there, and it's just more with more operations, running more bookstores, printing more books, Bibles, and all that. Like because the China Christian Council, the main duty was to do the overall coordinations of all the major policies and foreign relations, printing of the Bible, and printing of the Christian literatures. Those are their main task. There haven't been any change, just increase of the workload. Yes. Yes.
When I visited Shanghai, China, we've gone to the International Church many times.
Yes.
And we had a friend with us who was a Chinese national, and she was not allowed to go to that church. Is that going to change at any point in time?
Yes and no. She's not allowed to go there. She's not allowed to go to the foreigners' worship. It's a separation because they are the worship. There are many worships for the locals, which you can free to go. I work in I was the honorary pastor of the international church for a year. I lived in Shanghai before, so I work in both the foreign expat groups and also the local groups. And I'm sort of a unique. I'm sort of because I have a strange role that I can work in both camps. So basically, there's a policy in China that for not only for the Christians but all the religious venues, there are separate venue and meeting place for the foreigners, and they're separate for the nationals. There's a demarcation line there dictated by law. For example, for the mosque, there are many mosques with the high concentration of Muslim populations by the Middle Eastern merchants, more than 50,000 of them, clustered near in Tan city in Wuyi, and they have more than 20 mosques. But they're all by their own separate. The Syrians have one, the Iraqi have one, the Iranians have some others, and Saudis have their own, and so the Kuwaitis. But the Chinese ones, Muslims will have separate mosques. So similarly, even for the Mormons, they have separate. For the churches, each city their international church for foreigners. But they're all there. Actually, there was a request by the expat communities not to have Chinese nationals to be with them, so that because they don't have enough space. But again, they may be an excuse. But the other problem is that there may also be a problem that many of the local Chinese would like to see foreigners for other ulterior motive for getting into those meetings. That I've seen many, getting a shooter or whatever. Yeah, I've seen many cases. But again, it's easy for the administration too, because in the foreign churches, you can teach whatever what you like, totally separate from the Chinese context. In other words, you can have very extreme charismatic groups. For example, in Beijing, Beijing has 14 different foreign churches. By the Norwegians have one, the Koreans have several. There's a few English ones, one charismatic, one evangelical in the north, and they even with the foreigners, they have different denominations. So they have different groups, and then the Chinese will have their own. And basically, it is for the foreigners' freedoms. They can do whatever they like. And hence the demarcation line in there. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a commonly used translation of the Bible? And does the government restrict the distribution or even censor its contents?
Now, I've heard that for the past 30 years, your question. And I don't know why this question is still being asked, because there's only one translation that we have been using since 1920. 1921, I forgot the year. This is called the Union Translation. In China, we all use this one single translation. The government author, I never heard of that. I don't know who have this being rumor. The easiest way is that you go to China and buy a Bible and check it verse by verse, yes. There have been a few words changing because of typo error, whatever, some wordings. But basically, it's exactly the same Bible. Because in China, to a way that in the Chinese Christianity, we almost look at the Bible as the paper god. So this is we have a high view on the Bible. Nobody dares to do anything with it. So no, there's no so-called censorship. No, there is no alternation. We are still using the same version, which is very much outdated, but nobody dares to change it, almost like our KJV. Nobody dares to change it. We try to attempt for several different new translations, but nobody dares to change it for traditional reasons. Exactly, that's the point. And the distribution, the problem is that the Bible that is printed in China publicly are sponsored by the Union Bible Society in the paper. That's why the cost is very low. Now, I'm using the RMB basis, the Chinese currency. One Bible is cost only 26, that's about $3 US. $4 US now. But we have to pay another $5 US of paper, the Bible paper, contributed basically from Hong Kong. We donate the money. So that the costing of the Bible originally from 8 or 9 US to only $4 US. And also we donate the whole printing machinery, $3 million US about in 1980s from Hong Kong, so that they don't have any overhead costings. And then the Union Bible Society sent teams of technicians to teach them to use it. So therefore, the Bible cost will be in the low to the point that anyone can buy it. But it's not allowed to sell outside of the church. Otherwise, once you sell it outside of church, the price went up. People speculate. I've seen that some of those people went to the church, bought the Bible, and sell it in the bookstore for 3 times of the cost. So we don't want that. So we limit all the sales of the Bible in the church so that any Christian can buy it. First of all, is to serve the Christians, not the non-Christians. Now we have more than enough, and anyone can go to any churches and buy the Bible at cost, at that price. But right now, we are using different versions. I've seen that English versions, sort of two translation, whatever, different versions. So in other words, why the Bible is not being sold in the public store is demand by the church. Otherwise, the price will go up so fast, and then you have the dual price, and people will speculate. And then the Christian cannot afford to buy the Bible at a cost that has been subsidized heavily by other Christians outside of China. It's also a rule by the Union Bible Society, dictated with the China Christian Council. If you sell outside of the church, we will stop the subsidies. It's not fair for the Christians if that's the case. So that's the main reason. That is the main reason. Yeah. Okay.
Every time I go to China, I buy Bibles from the church and bring it back and give them to students. So
Bring it back to outside of China or what?
I bring it back to the U.S., to Baylor, and give them to Chinese students here.
The problem is that each Bible you bring out, it costs us a lot. Really. I don't encourage that, because you can buy the same Chinese Bible printed in Hong Kong elsewhere at that production cost, which is 3 times as much as in China.
My point is there's
Yeah.
no need to smuggle Bibles to China.
I don't see why we need to smuggle it, except that they're just ecologically not friendly.
My question is, do you see a movement among the churches in China to improve their impact and their contribution to the communities, to Chinese society? Is there a movement
Yes,
to make
yes.
a difference?
Now, ever
What
since,
types of ministries do you see there?
okay, now, in the past, even if you want to do some social services, you are not allowed because of the clear separation of church and state. And also, in the past, China will regard that all social services is under the government's jurisdiction. It's none of your business. But since in the mid-1990s, the government began to relax the policy and they experiment with some groups. One of the very first groups that's allowed to experiment with social service was in Guangdong province. They asked the church to do it. I was in one of the very first team invited outside of China to help out to start up things. And ever since then, the experiment in Guangdong was okay. So the government told all the religious groups that please do more social services. Now in the elderly's home, clinics, hospitals, basically almost in all the churches that I know of, they are doing some kind of community services. Not that sometimes they wanted to, sometimes it's by the order of the government. But the problem in China is that the churches are very usually lack of resources. So they have to stretch the resources very, very thin. So sometimes I don't encourage them to do too much. Otherwise, they would basically major the minors and forgot the essential callings of ministry. Running an elder's home is not easy. If you have lack of pastoral staff and all that, where's the priority of the church? So yes, right now, since a few years ago, this is almost like a government decree that all social groups, especially religious groups, has to do charity work. So it's almost like a benchmark. You have to do it. Even though if you don't want to, you have to do it. So they all have to come up with, charity week, I'm going to do some kind of voluntary services, whatever. Yes, it's highly encouraged. The impact has been felt quite clearly in China already. But the costing is extremely high. Very costly. Yes.
There are a lot of Americans and other foreigners that have a desire to go to China as missionaries.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as the role of the foreign
Okay.
missionary in China, or what should it be?
Now, look at the growth of the church in China, like 3 million in the 1980s, and in the 1990s, 10 years later, it's about at least 10 millions, and now it's about 40, 50 millions. The huge rapid growth rate, mostly I would say, is by Chinese themselves. So we learn from them. How effective are your mission works in United States, please? Are you doing anything better than the Chinese without foreign help? So what can you contribute to China, please? They have developed a mission model that is far exceeds our imagination. So sometimes, okay, put it this way. I will feel that when I go there, it's my personal journey, I have as much as to learn as to offer. Each time I visit them, my life gets blessed, encouraged. I see things that I could never imagine before. At the same time, there are things that I can share with them which they need in a way. So I will not use the term missionary as if it's one side that I have something that give to you. I think this mentality is not very much encouraged now in the ecumenical family. As I see the newer churches, younger churches are growing, which in a very unprecedented speed and also modeled, which is beyond our even framework of reference. So I have a lot to learn from the Christians in China. So when I say you want to be a missionary to China, first of all, are we anything better than the local missionaries that they are doing this kind of growth? Secondly, what do we have to offer that they really need, or are we trying to duplicate our model which proved to be better than theirs? Or what? Now, we have to think very carefully on those terms. It's a matter of mentality, and bottom line is spirituality. That do we still carry this kind of I wouldn't use the term patronizing attitudes, but I could not think of another term, that we are better than that. So, but partnership, yes. Partnership, yes. We can all benefit from each other. So before I would say that discourage someone to go to China, I say encourage you go there and learn. You learn more. And then after you learn, after you experience, then you ask yourself, what do I have to offer? Before I think of I'm going to offer something to others. Not only to China, but to other younger churches as well.
You mentioned temporary registrations.
Yes.
For those churches
Mhm.
that are not eligible
Yes.
to be registered.
Yeah.
What then qualifies a church to be registered?
Good
What
point.
would be the normal
Okay.
requirements?
The details is in the book, but basically 6 conditions. Very simple. If you want to register in a religious group in China, first of all, you got to have a fixed venue. You don't rent it, you have to own a fixed venue, because if you're always moving around, how are they going to track you down if you're in trouble? Fixed venue. Because once you register, the government has to be responsible for the group. So it's their skin and stake. So they have to make sure that you're okay. Otherwise, if there's anything in trouble, they are the one who has to be responsible for everything, and they may lose their job. Okay. You have to have a fixed venue. You have to have a clear constitution that those people who are elected has to be basically representing the people. Otherwise, I say I'm now called by God. I'm the Jesus II. I'm going to have a new group. Can I not register with me and God as my whatever disciples? No, you got to have a constitution that basically government sees that your running is basically accountable. And then you got to have an account system that is opened. And also account system involved with something that you got to be able to balance your book. Because, for example, if I register, then I'm going to, we know where your income coming from, how your expenses, can you balance your book, can you show me? Otherwise, there are 2 problems in there. One problem is that if the money is coming from outside, then they are afraid that the group may be controlled by outside. That is not politically not allowable in China. Sovereignty issues. Secondly, what if after 1 or 2 years that you went bankrupt, you owed a lot of people money, and then the government has to step in, and then the RAB has to bail you out. So finance, administration, venue, and also your beliefs in systems. Is it? You say that you're a Christian. How do I know that it's a Christian? Can you verify to me? Otherwise, anyone can create any group. Say so because China likes to have it in under one categories. No, which religion? You cannot say the others. So therefore, you got to have a process to make sure your verification that wet by some group, say the Christian Council, whatever, that you are a legitimate, bona fide, legally accepted religion. That's the 4th, and plus the doctrine and all that setup, the constitution, the setup, and all that church polity. And the 5th category is that you got to have someone who are qualified, trained to lead you. Not that I was giving a vision, then I can start something, and then I can preach whatever. So you have a qualified whatever people to do it. So the training, the vetting of the clergy, whatever, that has to be worked out. And the 6th one, basically I forgot the 6th one, I have to check the books. But most of the groups cannot fulfill all 6 requirements. That's why they're still in the temporary things. Usually is that they don't have enough money to buy a venue. So that church building fund. Because in China there's no mortgage, you have to pay cash, one shot. And a church group cannot be a collateral, because it's worth nothing in there. So therefore you got to save enough money to one shot and buy things and build the whole thing within 1 or 2 years. Before that you're in temporary registration. So basically those are the requirements, because constitution is easy. And the other problem is that about the finance part. Some of the groups are so poor that they cannot actually afford to do that. They have to be subsidized from other groups, other regional groups. So they're not basically independent. So therefore they say Mother Church and newly established mission point. So the mission point cannot be a fully registered church. is financially depend on the other groups. So until it's have sufficient independence, then they can register or to fulfill all the requirements. Otherwise, it's a temporary registration.
Okay, let's take 2 more questions and then we'll kind of bring our session to a close if we have them. Yes.
You mentioned that the separate foreigner churches have complete freedom what they want to teach. What are the main restrictions that the registered churches, in comparison, what are the issues that they need to stay away from?
Basically, all the theoretically, there is no restriction on the doctrines on the preaching the doctrines, but there are political restrictions not only against the church but the whole nation as well. That you don't speak against the party, you don't slander against our leaders, and you don't like discussions in contrary on the political dictatorship of the party. In other words, you try to preach the democratic movements, you're trying to support the dissidence movement. Those are considered as anti-revolutionary. We no longer using this term now, legally speaking. It's changed into some kind of instigate social disharmony. So in other words, there are a clear political framework of reference, not only to the church, but for the whole nation. So the church is just one subgroup that you know that those are the political boundary. You don't use the pulpit to preach, say, oh, next day let's have a revolution against the godless communists. Then you will be doomed. Then they will say that you are preacher. You are not. It's not. You are actually violating certain kind of law. So those are the basic political restriction is the only basic thing. But doctrinal wise, there's none. You can preach the second coming of Christ all the time, and you can preach like even in areas you can even preach, for example, it's creationism. Technically, it's against the state doctrines, but it's allowed in the church. But you don't preach outside of the church. So basically, yes, other than political issues, doctrinal-wise, is totally, the government doesn't even care. They only care about the political agenda if there's any.
Is that changing?
Changing is, you mean China as a whole?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, is China changing? Yes and no. See, any answer in China is yes and no. And yes, there are areas that are changing slowly, gradually. For example, more rooms for the civil society to develop, more participatories of these non-government groups, more consultation with the government. They listen to you more, and then there are more law abidings, especially the military and the public security areas. Is much more very strict on the legal side. So yes, there's changing. On the other hand, there's no change. There's still one party that rules all. The parameter of not against the current policy is still in place. So we just have to check the latest, the fashion, the political agenda. Then we know what we can talk and what we cannot. And that part is sometimes changes depending who's in place. So we have the new leader. We are just watching. It's only 1 year, so in the coming 2 months there will be a very preliminaries, and we are expecting some new policies to come out, especially in the banking and finance area, but not much on the social areas. Not yet. No. Okay. Yes and no. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Can you describe the relationship between the registered churches and the non-registered churches?
Okay.
And what kind of conflicts, and whether it's possible that there could be a dialogue in the future?
There has always been dialogues. All depends where you are and whom those groups you are talking with. Like, are the Baptists talking with the Methodists here? No, think of it this way. Don't try to categorize just 2 camps. Try to categorize them just like Protestant churches all over the world. We are all having our own will. Otherwise, we are not Protestant. right? Otherwise, we are Catholics. Even with the good old Catholic Church, you still have different groups within which you have different voices. So don't think of it as just black and white. Within the CCC, there are so many different groups. They, on the facade, a very good Chinese facade, we are always in unity. Just like the World Council Church, I work with the World Council Church. We are all in unity. But in fact, we all have our own agendas. And at the same time, you call the non-registered groups, there's so many different non-registered groups. They all operate independent from each other. So you see, our independence is part of a hallmark of Protestantism. So just like any other places, are all these churches here in Waco working together? And which align with others? It all depends on the agenda, right? And also depending on who is in leadership. I've seen in most of the cities that I know, those groups are crossing over so much that sometimes you don't see the differences. They all switch alliance depending on who's leading, who's preaching, who's doing what. There's no clear, like the division is not theological in China. The division is by personalities, leaderships. Now, aren't we all in here mostly? Now, so therefore, it all depends on which region. In some places, there are different players at stake, and they may have tensions, but others, they may have alliance. And then once you have the change leadership, the dynamics will be reconfigured all the time. So in other words, it's like a huge matrix, always changing. There's no clear model. There are all kinds of possibilities. And I say that most of the Christians in China, they attend both camps. Whoever who's giving good teaching, they'll go there. Basically, that's the bottom line. And no, there's no clear answer to that. Yes, there's so many different models. To respond to you, finally, I actually spoke with some of the government officials who are in charge of Christian affairs in some region where there's a lot of Christians. He always asks me a question, because even the government knows all these register, non-register, who's doing what. I mean, there's no secret. He always asks me, Reverend Chen, you are a Christian? I said, yes, I am. Besides academic, I'm also an ordained minister. Aren't you guys believing the same God? I said, of course. Why can't you guys work together? He's a communist, he's an atheist. I said, we tried for 2,000 years already. Let me answer your questions.